You may recall the description of the man with the muck rake, the man who could look no way but downward, with the muck rake in his hands, who was offered a celestial crown for his muck rake, but who would neither look up nor regard the crown he was offered, but continued to rake to himself the filth of the floor. Theodore Roosevelt, 1906. Theodore Roosevelt knew the importance of journalism as it pertained to the public perception, and that's why a very certain type of unruly and investigative reporter bothered him so much. A type of reporter who he called muckrakers. A type of reporter like Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair was born into an affluent Baltimore family, and it is said that he had read every book in his family's household before he was 10. When he turned 14, he wrote articles and jokes in children's newspapers in order to pay for his college admission. With a literary history like that, it's no wonder he would become one of the United States' most influential authors. In the 1900s, meat was processed by a disassembly line, where meat was passed down a line and each part of the animal was separated and processed. Most workers were paid a pittance, but some expert workers were paid extra to do their job very fast, setting an uncomfortable and potentially dangerous pace for other workers. No heating or cooling was supplied to the workers, adding to the discomfort. Upton's most famous novel, The Jungle, tells the tale of Jurgis, an immigrant who finds a job at a meat-packing company. Through Jurgis's eyes, we see the horror of the meat-packing firsthand. Not only do we see many injuries arise from the forced speed of the assembly line, but we see how there was no workers' compensation. If you were hurt on the job, there was nothing to help you. Upton also wrote about how meat was left in potentially rat-infested areas, or how meat was repackaged and mislabeled to allow gross and old meat to be sold. These details were informed by Upton's own experience interviewing meat workers and from going and viewing the meat lines himself. Probably the grossest part of the meatpacking industry was the lack of gloves, which only became commonplace after World War I. Many sores and injuries would open up on the workers' hands from handling meat and chemicals in the amount they did, and these cuts and sores led to blood and even pus contaminating the meat. Probably a runner-up for second most gross is In the Jungle. One passage describes how some workers fell into vats used in processing and would end up as horribly mutilated corpses, some leaving only their bones behind. Upton had hoped that the world would see his novel and become sympathetic to the plight of the workers' conditions. And while his novel had a great effect on the populace, it wasn't his intended effect. U.S. audiences who read the novel were more repulsed at the treatment and sanitization of their meat than they were at the treatment of the workers. To quote Upton Sinclair himself, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach." Upton Sinclair ran under the Socialist Party for Congress unsuccessfully multiple times in the 1920s, but would later run for governor under the Democratic Party unsuccessfully, while still getting more votes than in his previous attempts. About his unsuccessful campaign, he would later write, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it." Sinclair's loss was mainly chalked up to the large smear campaign led by various moguls and businessmen, and has been considered one of the largest in American history. Fight for reform. One change Sinclair's novel helped inspire was the creation of the FDA under the FDR administration. He was also known to attend rallies, and at one for the free speech of workers in 1923, he was arrested while reading from the Bill of Rights. One officer was reported to have said, "We'll have none of that Constitution stuff." Personal life. Sinclair was a known agnostic, and he looked at Christianity with contempt. In one book, called The Prophets of Religion, he outlined how religion allowed the rich to steal from the poor. He had married 3 times. The first one had left him after he refused to give up writing, and the last one he married after the death of the second. Both he and his second wives had affairs from each other. Other literary works. The Jungle wasn't his only book, as Upton was as well written as he was read. Oil. Oil is based on the Teapot Dome scandal, where President Warren G. Harding's Secretary of the Interior accepted bribes in order to give favorable leases to oil companies. The novel tells the tale of Bunny Ross, whose father is a self-made oil tycoon. Bunny respects his father greatly, until he finds out the shady business deals his father uses to be able to drill for oil. Bunny is torn between his father and his radical communist friend Paul. The novel ends with his father's death, Bunny not inheriting his father's wealth, and him deciding to live a humble life and becoming a social activist. King Cole. King Cole is a similar novel to The Jungle, but it is about the oil industry. Largely inspired by the Ludlow Massacre, where the Colorado National Guard attacked a camp of over 1,000 striking coal and iron miners. It tells the tale of the son of a coal mine magnate named Hal Warner. Hal is wealthy, but decides to get a job in a coal mine so he can observe the conditions encountered therein. He befriends the coal miners and loses the preconceived notion of the miners instilled in him by his magnate father. The Lanny Bud Novels. One of Sinclair's more obscure works, it follows Lanny Bud, whose fictitious life highlights various happenings spanning the two world wars. The third book series, called The Dragon's Teeth, even won a Pulitzer Award. The novels cover such events as the stock market crash, the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, and the Spanish Civil War. He also wrote I, Governor of California, and How I Ended Poverty, which details how he won the governor's spot for California. If you are confused by the fact that I earlier said he lost, don't be. Upton wrote this before running, and it outlined his expectations of what he assumed at the time would be his victory. But he wrote it in the past tense as though it had already happened. That's a little pretentious if you ask me.